What's up, guys? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran, and I have with me Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst, straight from Moscow. And today we're going to be taking a look at Trident Juncture 2018, NATO exercises on Russia's border. Okay, I am here with Mark Sleboda via Moscow. Mark, welcome once again to the Duran. And today you are going to be speaking about Operation Trident Juncture 2018. What is this? What are NATO's goals? Who is NATO doing this exercise against? What are they protecting themselves against? Is this routine? Is this every year? Tell our viewers exactly what's going on with Trident Juncture 2018, because it is a massive, massive exercise.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the Duran. You've got to love the names that NATO, the United States, and the other member states choose for their war games. Trident Juncture. I'm not exactly sure what a Trident Juncture is. A trident has about 3 prongs. The juncture, I have no idea. But it sounds cool. Right? So this is a significant exercise for multiple reasons. This is the largest NATO military exercise since the Cold War. Now, in a recent video, we covered the Vostok 2018 Russian military exercises, which was the largest military exercise that Russia has conducted since the Cold War, maybe ever. And previous to that, we saw the Zapad, the West, 2017 in Russia. And before that, we saw the last NATO biggest military exercise since the Cold War with the Anaconda 2016 NATO military exercise in Poland and the Baltics. So if you see the pattern here, we have increasing one-upmanship and saber-rattling with both NATO and Russia conducting largest military exercises since the Cold War. It's getting worse, right? The tensions are getting higher, and the military preparations for actual conflict, conventional conflict, are getting larger and more systemic. Now, there's another reason, not only the size, that this military exercise is so specific, is where it's happening. It's happening in Norway. And it's been a long time, back to the 80s, since we've seen anything even approaching this, since we've had any large-scale NATO military exercise in Norway. It's significant. I mean, for the numbers wise, there's going to be over 50,000 NATO troops involved from all 29 members, and then several thousand from both Finland and Sweden as well. And that's significant because Finland and Sweden are not NATO members. We'll get back to that. So 50,000 troops. Over 250 aircraft, over 65 naval vessels, and over 10,000 military vehicles. Okay, that's a pretty significant rollout. The drill is also significant because usually we've seen these exercises begin with the NATO forces already on the ground and beginning the exercise. But in this exercise, the actual landing of the troops, basically in a conflict theater, and they're moving, landing, and then moving up to the front lines and engaging, is part of the scenario. And it will simulate large numbers of troops landing from crossing the Atlantic from the United States, from Canada, and from all over Europe and coming up into Norway. That's significant because that is, the basic plan for conventional war in Europe with Russia. That is going to require pulling large numbers of troops from the U.S. and all over Europe to wherever the conflict zone is. Also, we're seeing a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Arctic. Now, I served in the U.S. Navy, and the last time in the 90s, and the last time a U.S. aircraft carrier was above the Arctic was before I served in the Navy. That should tell you something there. And Russia is taking a look at this very closely, seeing a U.S. aircraft carrier that close to its borders. And this has to be stressed. Norway, of course, has a border with Russia. And Russia is extremely upset with the scale of this exercise, again on its borders. Now, Finland and Sweden are participating in this exercise with a couple thousand troops each. Not only are they participating, but their military bases on their soil are part of the larger war game exercise. Now, Finland and Sweden are not part of NATO, so you might say, what's up? Well, that's because Finland and Sweden have the elites, the political military elites have basically been trying to push Finland and Sweden to join NATO. And at this point, we can basically say that Finland and Sweden are definitely de facto NATO members, all right? And they're obviously indicating that they are more than willing to work with NATO in any conflict situation with Russia. And so we see at this point the militarization of the entire Scandinavian region, which has not been a principal area of military concern for Russia, well, since before the 80s, really.
Right. Right. Is this a yearly? This is not a yearly exercise.
No, this is not a yearly exercise. A Trident Juncture, the last time we saw a Trident Juncture was several years ago, and that was in Portugal. So, I mean, it's the same name, and it indicates the name, the continuance of that indicates the large scale of the exercise and certain interoperability drills that are part of it. But it's not an annual exercise. So it's a pretty significant development.
Now NATO has not specifically mentioned that these war games are geared towards Russia. Why do you think that is? Is it just implicit Russia understands this already? And what does this have to do, Mark, with the recent rhetoric that we've been hearing about the Arctic? A lot of jockeying for position in the Arctic as well. Yeah.
So yeah, of course. I mean, that's what they say, right? I mean, that's the standard, diplo speak, that it's not aimed at Russia. That of course is nonsense. Just like the idea that Russia's Zapad Western exercises in Belarus last year were not directed against NATO. All right, that is the last degree of plausible deniability here. Even ABC News, in their recent article on the Trident Juncture exercises, says, but everyone knows, who the real audience for this exercise is. It's being put on, not only to demonstrate, to improve NATO's military readiness, but it's also, of course, saber rattling and a display of military strength. To intimidate Russia. That's pretty obvious. Let's see here.
Dealing with the Arctic, is this directly connected to what we've been reading about recently of all the powers, including Norway? You have Norway, you have U.S., obviously Russia, that they're all jockeying for position to lay claim to the riches and resources of the Arctic.
Yeah. Of the Arctic littoral states, the five Arctic nations, Russia by far already has the largest area of the Arctic that are within its territorial waters and its exclusive economic zone. Russia has also filed, as several other countries of these countries have, filed for an extension of its continental shelf, basically, which would extend this territorial waters and economic zone even further. This is with the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which will be judging that. And of course, what everyone is looking at, Canada has done so as well, as have several other countries. Everyone, of course, is concerned, and not only, of course, about the strategic position of the Arctic. I mean, the United States and Russia are a lot closer to each other, of course, over the Arctic than they are across Europe. And remember the close proximity of Alaska and Vladivostok, Siberia. The big concern is oil and natural gas resources. Fishing and other rights are also important there, but the big thing is oil and natural gas. And already, like I said, the majority of the oil and natural gas lies within Russia's zones, and if that area is extended even further, that will see it, Russia's benefit even more from the Arctic. Another thing of major concern is because of climate change and the warming of the Arctic, and yes, it obviously is happening, and the Russian military and the Russian Academy of Sciences are all well aware and well documented in reporting on it, is the opening of the Northern Passage for trade up above Russia. And this has a big potential, particularly with China, because a trade route, a naval trade route that would go to Europe and to the United States and Canada through the Arctic, particularly in the almost ice-free summer that we're looking at in the near future, will be a significant development with global trade. And Russia has already been laying claim to the potential for this as mostly falling within its territorial waters. And it will, of course, have to position military and rescue equipment to control, secure that trade route. And by far, Russia is the country in the world that has, first of all, the most population north of the Arctic Circle, with a significant number of cities of size up above there, but also military research stations and industrial facilities as well. You have to remember Canada, which is the biggest other Arctic littoral state. The vast majority of its population is squeezed in the south against the border of the United States. One of the major things that is going to be needed, not only for trade in the Arctic, but also for any potential military operations, is icebreakers. And right now, Russia is the only country that really has capability with several nuclear-powered, basically super icebreakers that the United States and other countries lab. And actually, you will hear continual talk when the Arctic is discussed about an icebreaker gap, because even in the summer, in the coming decade or two, ice will still be a major concern along this Northern Passage during the summer. And then in the winter, of course, we'll continue to see ice for, another 50 to 100 years up there easily. You really need these icebreakers. And Russia has even developed and started to deploy floating nuclear power stations to power research military bases in the Arctic. So we're looking at the continuing militarization of the Arctic on all sides. This military exercise is clearly a spear pointed at that and saying that NATO will not let the Arctic go uncontested in one form or another. And, of course, they do have to provide for contingency with Russia already having significant forces up there. Now, that said, I don't want to overplay the possibility of Arctic conflict because of the small populations up there, still a relatively small strategic and economic concern. and simply the difficulty of conducting any kind of combat above the Arctic Circle, specifically up above Russia there. It's a very harsh territory, and for instance, most U.S. naval vessels simply can't operate up there, along with many other countries. So let's not overplay, at least at the current day, the possibility of conflict in the Arctic. But militaries always think of the future and contingency and so on.
So you mentioned that we are, with every military exercise and every war game that's taking place, they're getting bigger and bigger. So it seems to me that we're looking at a little bit of mission creep or war creep every year, more and more. Where is this leading to? Is this going to, I mean, we're now 50,000 troops. Are we going to see 60,000 from Russia's next exercise? Are we going to see 100,000 soon in the coming years after that? Where is this heading towards? Because I'm trying to think about how much longer can this continue without there being some sort of tripwire.
Yeah, well, Russia has already had larger than 50,000. These the Vostok exercises that Russia conducted this year with China. First of all, they weren't on NATO's border. They were very far to the east,
right?
Very far away from any NATO country. And they were quite significant. Russia says they included over 300,000 troops. That's probably a bit of operation exaggeration, including troops that were simply on standby, on call within the theater, but definitely at least around 100,000 troops that were actively participating. But this is all within Russia's borders and one country.
And 50,000 troops for Norway. I mean, Norway's a small country, so to pack in 50,000 troops is...
That's a huge number. And of course, 12,000 of those were U.S. troops. Now, Norway's defense minister, speaking about the drills and, the militarization of Scandinavia, he said that he noted, it's quite specifically, that Norway does not consider Russia to be a direct military threat. So you might ask, why is this going on? Because by conducting exercises like this, hosting them right on Russia's border, they seem to be doing their best to try to make Russia a direct military threat to their country. And I think we've seen a big change since the Cold War, when even during the Cold War, Norway kind of kept at a degree of remove, and Finland and Sweden were decidedly neutral. We've seen a lot of elite capture, where we see the political and military leaders of Norway increasingly are trained in the United States by NATO, and increasingly identify themselves and are dragging their countries into this military bloc formation. You wouldn't think of Norway as a hotbed of U.S. military confrontation with Russia, but there's now recently Norway requested that the U.S. Marine contingent stationed in Norway, yes, there are U.S. Marines stationed in Norway, double up to 700 U.S. Marines stationed in Norway. And Norway and the U.S. both make a big deal out of saying that these aren't permanent troops, like NATO deployments in Poland and the Baltics. These are designed to avoid violations of the NATO Founding Act and the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty by their rotating troops. They rotate out regularly. Of course, they're immediately replaced by new troops, which Russia rightly says, this is a clear violation of these articles, and that these are, there is a permanent military presence there, even if old troops are rotating out, new troops are rotating in. These are designed as kind of human shield tripwire forces, but they're not a military threat at level like 700. But we've already seen contingents in the Baltics and Poland increase and increase and increase, and we're already looking at thousands of troops there. So the numbers could increase in the future. And the U.S. and Norway make clear that the U.S. does not have a military base per se in Norway. But actually, Norway has a secret cave system that is stuffed full of American tanks, artillery, and military equipment. This is the Marine Corps' Norway pre-positioning program. In caves in Norway, they have pre-positioned some 6,500 military vehicles, including Abrams tanks, howitzers, and amphibious assault vehicles and the like. This is enough to provide military equipment for an entire Marine expeditionary force, somewhere between 14 and 18,000 U.S. Marines. And this is a pretty significant amount of gear that is hidden in cave networks beneath Norway in a not so secret that is, again, it's obviously directed against Russia. And it adds to this tension in the area with the number of U.S. troops right up against Russia's border, U.S. military equipment right up against Russia's border. Russia doesn't care about Norway's military, Norway conducting military exercises within Norway's borders, right? That's perfectly fair. But when you have the U.S. on the other side of the Atlantic, with this large numbers of troops stationed, gear, military exercises, that's when Russia starts to get really concerned. And NATO, of course, says that everything they do is defensive. This is all defensive. They're countering Russian aggression. Here's the thing. NATO, while it bills itself as a defensive organization, has never been used as a defensive organization against a state actor in its history. Article 5 has never been invoked against a state actor. You could talk about Al-Qaeda and the ridiculousness of NATO responding there, but it has never been used as a defensive organization against another state. And if we take a look at what NATO has done, you might say, well, what is NATO's purpose after the Cold War? Because it keeps expanding east, closer to Russia's borders, as Russia goes increasingly concerned and tense. NATO, we have to remember, is a military organization that the Warsaw Pact was created to counter. And the mission of NATO during the Cold War is often summarized as it's designed to keep the U.S. in Europe, to keep the Soviets, Russia, out of Europe, and to keep Germany down.
Right.
And we still actually see a lot of that mission being kept today. Richard Sakwa, a British professor, very well versed in Russian and Eurasian concerns, has noted that NATO is basically in a fateful geopolitical paradox, that it exists primarily to manage the risks and tensions created by its own existence, because that is what Russia is most concerned about, not the EU, not these other organizations, but a military bloc that is specifically designed and pointed at it. And we have to admit that NATO is the most powerful and the most aggressive and belligerent military bloc in the world. And I say that as a U.S. military veteran of NATO operations. If you take a look at what NATO has evolved into, it's as a tool for U.S. projection of power and hegemony around the world. Often it's a political fig leaf. The UK and France are the only really significant countries, but sometimes that political the fig leaf of international community support really matters. NATO, of course, was involved in the illegal attack without UN Security Council approval and the dismemberment of Serbia, the carving off of Kosovo as a little NATO military protectorate with the Kosovo Liberation Army, which had just previously been listed by the United States as a terrorist organization, and with good reason, human organ smuggling and all, right up to their current leadership was involved in that. It put the KLA in charge of the country, where they still are to this day. And Kosovo was one of the biggest recruiting sources in all of Europe for ISIS and similar terrorist groups. So we saw Serbia. NATO was also involved, of course, in the illegal attack on regime change in Libya. After the U.S. Military invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, NATO was brought in post facto roles and continued to be involved in the occupations of those countries. And of course, NATO member states, not under the official NATO rubric, but you would think that the bloc would still be responsible for its military activities. NATO member states, the United States, the UK, and others have been involved in the war on Syria and the Saudi invasion and occupation of Yemen, with both the United States and the United Kingdom having ground special forces, naval forces, air assets that are actively military supporting Saudi Arabia there. So, what does that all lead up to? That is the most aggressive military bloc on the face of the earth today. And, you can see a clear history of this. And when NATO says, oh, we're defensive, Russia has nothing to be concerned about. Well, regime change, again and again and again. I think Russia actually has pretty good reason to be concerned, despite having a nuclear deterrent. And of course, the real danger is not NATO invading Russia or Russia invading NATO. That would both sides agree that is, quickly spiral into a World War III scenario. But the remaining gray areas between the two countries. Ukraine. What if a color revolution and a civil war breaks out in Belarus or Kazakhstan? What would NATO and Russia do there? Those are where the real Georgia is another flashpoint. And we see even as far afield as Syria, there's all kinds of potential, not just for U.S.-Russian direct conflict, but actual NATO. Turkey, of course, still technically being a member of NATO. So we see all kinds of potential for NATO-Russia conflict, even when it's not directly initiated against each other. And that's these mission abroads that NATO, has become a vehicle for U.S. hegemony with. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, recently when Trump was in Europe and had, famously been very critical of NATO, calling it, I think, rightly as an archaic organization. Stoltenberg specifically pointed out in the utility of NATO to the United States that it is useful for U.S. military projection of U.S. military force into the Middle East. Well, that doesn't sound defensive to me. That's about hegemony.
Right.
And that's what NATO does for the U.S. today. It gives a fig leaf of support, military and political, for U.S. hegemonic operations around the world today. And that's what Russia sees when it's taking a look at exercises like Trident Juncture right on its border. And Russia responds. And in fact, in this exercise, Russia is suddenly announced that they're going to be conducting missile exercises within this same area, Russia's area closing close to Norway and the Baltics. And that's actually a little dangerous. Russia feels they need to respond to the size and goals of this Trident Juncture exercise, but that's, again, increasing the tensions, the possibility for mistakes, which could always misunderstandings, which is often how wars start, and that's what we don't want to see happen between NATO and Russia, because it could very quickly spiral into a nuclear confrontation, and we all know where that ends.
And I imagine to wrap it up, the recent walking back of the INF Treaty and the fact that we are going to probably see significant buildup of missiles in very close to Russia's borders. It does not help the situation whatsoever. What are your thoughts on the timing of that as well, Mark?
Yeah, I think we'll save the INF for a future episode.
Okay.
That I'm looking forward to doing for the Duran.
Do you think they're tied in? Do you think this Trident Juncture and the INF?
There's the potential for that. But to tell you the truth, I would say that the INF treaty, Putin has been very clear since the U.S. pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2001, that the INF treaty is not really in Russia's interests with the current technological and geopolitical realities. And I suspect that Russia, despite the rhetoric and calling it dangerous, is not all that upset about the U.S. being the one to unilaterally pull out of this treaty and taking the political heat for it.
Okay, we'll do that at another video for that, because that sounds really, really interesting to hear your views on it. Mark Sleboda via Moscow, thank you very much for discussing Trident Juncture 2018. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. And in the description box down below, you will find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Donate to the Duran so we can bring you videos with Mark Sleboda via Moscow. Thank you, Mark, once again for a great video. Take care.